Today, we're exploring one of the most important shifts in medicine, moving from episodic care to continuous precision health. What if precision medicine wasn't a promise for tomorrow, but a playbook for today? In this episode, we look at how continuous data, AI-enabled insights, and modernized trial designs are already reshaping decisions at the bedside, from closed-loop diabetes care and automated retinopathy screening to evidence that follows patients beyond the clinic walls. And as innovation accelerates, we examine what's truly valuable, what's just hype, and why clinicians and not algorithms must remain the final arbiters of care. Welcome to Stanford Medcast, a podcast from Stanford CME that brings you the latest insights from the world's leading physicians and scientists. If you're joining us for the first time, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, Spotify, or YouTube to stay updated with our newest episodes. I am your host, Dr. Ruth Adivuya. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Jessica Mega. Dr. Mega is a cardiologist and global leader in precision medicine and health innovation. She serves on the board of directors at Boston Scientific and Danaher Corporation, and she is a co-founder of Alphabet's Verily and the former chief medical officer of Google Life Sciences. Previously on faculty at Harvard Medical School and a senior investigator with the TIMI study group, Dr. Mega's research has shaped the fields of pharmacogenetics and large-scale clinical trials. She is a graduate of Stanford University, Yale School of Medicine, and the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Mega trained at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Massachusetts General Hospital, and her work has been widely published in leading medical journals. Welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being here.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Let's get started by talking a bit about your journey. You transitioned from Harvard and Brigham and Women's, where you were leading major international trials and directing the TIMI study group's genomics program, to co-founding Verily as its first chief medical and scientific officer. What cultural or philosophical differences did you notice between academia and Silicon Valley tech, and how have those shaped the way you approach solving health problems?
There are certainly similarities and differences, but the thing that stood out for me was two cultural lessons, one from being a physician and one for training in academia. So I'll start first with being a physician. If you think about a physician and what a transition to a tech community in Silicon Valley could look like, one thing they have in common is they're both very action-oriented. Think about a day in the hospital. It's fast-paced. We're always thinking about the next best action. You have a group of patients you're taking care of, and I'm a cardiologist, and let's say one patient develops ventricular tachycardia. That is where my energy needs to go. There's a very similar philosophy, especially when you're in a high-growth company. Verily is an Alphabet company that focuses on creating data and AI-powered precision health tools for life science and healthcare. When we were starting the company, we needed to be nimble. We would create a number of solutions. We'd test them quickly. We'd focus our attention on what was most needed. One similarity about being a physician and working in tech is that there's not a roadmap. There's not one standard day. And that is strength between the two. The other interesting piece from academia is rigor. How do you test new technologies? For me, it was new medicines, molecular diagnostics. I had Harvard figuring out the right clinical trials to run to get these solutions into the hands of patients and clinicians. The same thing is true with AI-generated clinical decision support. We had to think about the right scientific and clinical expertise, biostatisticians, regulatory experts to work with software and hardware engineers. The action orientation and the rigor is something that is a thread between all parts of my life.
I'm curious what differences stood out most clearly for you.
One difference is keeping an open mind into how do you actually solve problems. One thing that I found in joining Google, I was part of Google X, and then we spun out and became Verily, was thinking about ideas and healthcare solutions can come from anywhere, right? So there was an engineer who had never spent any time in healthcare and came up to me and asked about a new way of measuring heart damage, for example. And my initial response was, it's not the way we do it. As we stepped back and tested it, it wasn't the best solution in that moment, but it could have been. Training is important, but keeping an open mind to solving problems in a holistic way is something that was different.
I love the parallel you drew between the physician world and the tech world, that fast-paced, action-oriented rhythm of the hospital in a high-growth company. And I also heard you emphasize the rigor that underpins both. It makes me think about the teams driving those ideas forward at Verily and now at Boston Scientific. You've worked with and led groups that span clinicians, engineers, and data scientists. What have you learned about making collaboration across such different disciplines really work?
Key thing is curiosity. But I'm going to get to that in a minute because what you brought up was this theme of keeping grounded in reality. And I always say feet on the ground, head in the sky. Think big, but we don't want to think in a way that we're not grounded in what are the real problems that patients are facing, what are the real issues, what's effective, what's safe, what's valuable. When you bring cross-disciplinary teams together in that fashion, you have to be curious. Training today is amazing. You get so deeply trained that there can be silos. What teams need to do when they come together is embrace their expertise, but be open to collaborating. And one of my favorite values is this idea of starting with yes mentality. It doesn't mean that we say yes to everything because then you'd be everywhere but nowhere. But this idea that when someone comes to you with an idea, I talked about the engineer prior, to think about what would make it possible. It's easy when you're an expert to come up with a lot of reasons why something wouldn't work. But being open-minded is powerful. Curiosity is core to cross-disciplinary teams. What's interesting is I'll bring in a team member we may not have formally thought was a team member, right? We have clinicians, scientists, engineers, designers, but we were deliberate to also bring, in the context of clinical trials, participants as part of the team. And so maybe in the past, we would think about this is the person I mentioned who we're serving, this is the end user, but we had a number of different participants that were part of the team and they would give us feedback. And so there were some really interesting insights around how people wanted to interact with technology. And as it turns out, I think some of the biases around different ages, either being more or less tech forward, was very eye-opening. I learned a lot about individuals who said, yeah, we're really interested in study watches and two-way communication, and let's not put a lens on it. It goes back to patients and participants are people first. And now that we have more open lines of communication, how do we use that as a positive?
I love that response, and I really appreciate the imagery of feet on the ground, head in the sky, staying curious while remaining grounded in the realities of patient care. Your point about breaking silos also brought to mind some of your own research, where you helped demonstrate how a single genetic variant can alter a patient's response to antiplatelet therapy. And it's a powerful example of translating scientific insight into meaningful clinical impact. What did that work teach you about moving genetic discoveries into everyday care?
Thus far, we've been talking about how do you use precision insights to help patients broadly. We talk about precision health as new concepts, and they're getting more traction because we have more tools. But if we step back and really think about the big picture, clinicians have always been aiming to tailor therapies. If you and I talk about the blood smear refinements in the 1800s and 1900s, now when I see a patient in the hospital and they're anemic, I want to know, are their cells small? Are they microcytic? Are they big? Are they macrocytic? I'm not going to treat everyone with anemia with iron, for example, only those who have a certain clinical syndrome and smaller cells. I always ground precision medicine in this world that we've been trying to achieve for years. When it came to doing work in clinical trials, we're studying thousands of patients. What insights could we take beyond just the top line results that, let's say, if you open up the New England Journal of Medicine and you look at one therapy compared to another, you get some really great insights, but maybe you and I might respond differently to these medicines. So we went about creating a genomics unit, trying to understand how people responded to medicines. The observation that got the most traction was really looking at variants in the CYP2C19 gene. As it turns out, about a third of people don't respond optimally to a medicine called clopidogrel, which is very widely used for patients with cardiovascular disease. And its patients with certain variants just respond differently. They metabolize the drug differently. That was an interesting observation on this journey towards precision and how do we understand patients at the deepest level so we can offer the best care.
I'd love to continue the conversation on precision medicine because at its best, its promise is truly individualized care. But I think a lot of clinicians still rely on one-size-fits-all guidelines. What do you see as the biggest obstacle to making precision medicine more routine?
There's places where a more population-based approach makes sense. Work with the poly pill, for example, and other areas where Its side effects are relatively low, and we know that the benefits will be relatively similar among groups. It's a very reasonable strategy. I never think that population and precision medicine are at odds. I just always think about where's the right place to deploy it. So, what are some real barriers to precision medicine? I'll give you a few. One is that there has to be an intervention. It's one thing if we can identify something precisely, but we can't do anything about it. That doesn't help. The reason we use troponin, for example, it's a measurement of whether people have injury to their heart. It helps us decide whether someone needs a cardiac catheterization. Whenever I talk to groups doing precision diagnostics or anything in that area, I always think, what are we going to do with that information? So one barrier is just make sure if you're in this field that you're thinking about what would someone do? What is actionable? The second one, is it reproducible? A lot of the molecular tests and the genetics tests, we know what the outcome will look like and what we would do differently. With AI, for example, we have a lot of new areas where we're looking to use AI for understanding new diagnoses. We want to make sure the test is reproducible. Sometimes we might just need a simple integer risk score. Then the third one is precision medicine. A lot of times is around prevention, and we need to figure out ways to fund tools that are aimed towards prevention. So there's a lot of promise in precision medicine. It's not new, and we just have to pay attention to what are some of the pitfalls so that we really spend our time in the most actionable areas.
I appreciate you clarifying that population health and precision medicine aren't at odds with each other, but really complement each other depending on the context. I think that raises another critical dimension, making sure that these tools benefit all patients and not just a subset. How do you think we can deploy things like genomic testing, wearables, and AI in ways that close rather than widen health gaps?
One thing that's been interesting in the field of precision medicine, and I alluded to this a minute ago, is there's an appreciation that there's the deep biology, but there's also precision health, which opens the aperture to what is a human experiencing in their life. As we come up with these tools, we need to think about not just what's inside the four walls of a clinic, but what happens every single day. Do people have access to digital tools? What's going on with people's sleep patterns? What's going on with stress? Do people live in food deserts? This idea of precision health and really, again, casting a wider net. And I'm starting to see some encouraging research in some of the areas I just mentioned.
It makes me wonder how we prepare the next generation of clinicians to work within that broader frame. If you were designing a CME course or a residency curriculum today, what would you add to help equip clinicians for precision approaches?
Much of our training has been so specific because we've had to hold all of this information inside of ourselves, right? And we now have tools expanding beyond our own disciplines. We're starting to use AI to find synergies across different fields. If I was training right now, I would pay attention, certainly focus on an area that you love, but pay attention to the bigger picture. You have to remember people live in a very broad context. And so for me, I would just be paying attention to what I see in the four walls of the clinic, but also what's happening outside. And I'm trying to do that every day. I practice predominantly inpatient medicine, but when we discharge someone, they're going back into their life, into the world. How are they going to get the medicines that they need? What are the social dynamics? And so I just think bridging that is a very powerful skill moving forward.
I think that's really helpful to hear and understand. Pivoting a bit and talking more about what precision medicine actually looks like today, we now have an explosion of data coming from wearables and sensors. You've also talked about future clinicians needing to see the bigger picture. I think the real question is, how do we bridge that? And how do we turn all of that data into insights that a clinician can actually use at the bedside?
We are in a very interesting time where we now have higher degree analytics to take that data and harness insights to close the loop with a given person. Let me just give you a practical example. There are about 800 million people with diabetes. They need people who are there to help support them. We're starting to look at ways where we expand access, for example, to expert care. Not everyone can see an endocrinologist. So we're working with different tools, potentially a continuous glucose monitor for a period of time so someone can understand foods they eat and how that influences their glucose. There's a program that I worked with where we started to use analytics to extract and say, hey, what's happening on Wednesday? It looks like your glucose is spiking. Okay, that's the day they get together with friends. These closed loop systems in the hands of people and patients, I think is going to be a game changer. My grandfather was an incredibly dedicated patient and had diabetes and wrote his glucose numbers down in a composition notebook, but there was nothing we could do with it. I remember being frustrated. But now we have the tools. We just have to clinically engage in those tools and provide people the support.
One of the things you've spoken about is this idea of shifting from treating illness to maintaining wellness. What might an AI assisted health platform look like for a patient and their primary care physician between visits?
One idea is trying to think about healthcare not just as this episodic exchange. So someone comes in and they see me in the hospital because they have a heart attack. But really, we all have a baseline level of health and things change over time. This idea of trying to intervene before there's a problem is something where AI assisted platforms are likely going to be very helpful. I gave the example of working with patients with diabetes. Another place to think about is what kind of screening these patients need over time and how do we bring the barriers down. We know patients with diabetes, for example, you have consequences with your nerves, your kidneys, your heart, and your eyes. Patients need to undergo, for example, screening for diabetic retinopathy. Many patients who are not getting the screenings. But we were able to work on automated and AI-driven image reading for thousands of patients. So you have ophthalmologists able to not have to spend time on the reading, but actually spend time on the intervention. I'll break it down into two pieces. There's scaffolding that understands someone's baseline and changes over time. And then there are interventions along the way where we try to get ahead of a problem from happening. That's where the hope of AI and data will play out. Again, we have to go back to your earlier point. How do we make sure this is democratized and improves access and doesn't become isolated? But that's the true vision. And again, some of the interventions are already in play today.
Are there some technical hurdles that we still need to solve for before this is practical at scale?
There have been some true technical hurdles that have been accomplished and things that we should leverage. There have been huge gains in terms of distributed high volume computing. We used to spend a lot of time thinking about where do we compute? Where do we store the data? Nowadays, we know that high volume computing is out there. So that's a real win. The moment that is most fundamental now is where do you hit the practical realities? I think this is a real call to anyone who's listening, who's a clinician, a researcher, a patient, people who are genuinely interacting with health. How do we get these tools into the hands of patients? So I talked about patients with diabetes. How do we support these proactive tools? With clinicians, what's most valuable? We don't want alerts every minute, but with the patients with diabetes, what I can say in the programs I've been closest to, it was helpful to triage and say, here are the patients that need immediate interactions, the patients who may have been hypoglycemic overnight. It's not the technical hurdle as much as it is the implementation hurdle. But that's the reason I'm so excited. Let's figure out what's really working. Let's figure out where we add value. But there's a lot of great work to be done.
And I suppose that naturally raises the question, as AI becomes more integrated into practice, how do you see the clinician's role evolving?
The clinician's role is more important than ever because there were tools that came out that may have been what we might call more back office. So things that we're working on billing, paperwork, automation, or prior authorization. When you go to see your physician, there are tools that are translating what a clinical encounter looks like. They're being adopted because clinicians feel like they're helpful. We can say we are the ultimate arbiters and figure out what's most useful. This relationship of using tools for diagnostics and therapeutics, that's our core business.
I hope that's a reassuring reminder to clinicians who are concerned about the impact of AI that even as these tools evolve, clinicians will continue to be some of the final decision makers about what's truly useful and what ultimately gets adopted into the healthcare system. In your experience, on the flip side, what mindset shift has been the hardest for clinicians as they start adopting these tools?
We want tools that are reproducible and accurate. I talked earlier about using things like the blood smear. We use labs and believe our central labs because they're reproducible. When I get a value that's an LDL value, when I get creatinine, I know what to do with that. The biggest barrier is having systems that do what we want. We have to use the right tools for the right problems. If we're interested in drug interactions, there are some really nice charts. There's decision support embedded. We don't have to change that. If we want to tally a CHA2DS2-VASc risk score for a patient with an anticoagulant, we don't need to update now. Maybe in the future we will, because there might be patients that need something different. Let's use generative AI in its most powerful way. There's great work being done in new molecule design, so with drug discovery, interesting work on how to reach patients, translation, real-time understanding the grade level at which someone's information should be coming. Use the right tool for the right purpose, and then we're going to be much more successful.
That's a really great point, making sure that we use the right tools in the places where they are most powerful. And I think you had a chance to put that philosophy into practice at Verily when you worked on creating Project Baseline and reimagining trial infrastructure. What innovations like remote monitoring or real-world data made the biggest difference in efficiency or in the patient experience?
Clinical trials are fundamental to getting real changes in clinical practice, bridging research and care. What's changed is we no longer have to have episodic interactions. Data doesn't need to be episodic, and we can work with regulators more seamlessly. So let me give you an example where there have been new tools for participants for data monitoring and regulation. During the pandemic, when all of a sudden it was very hard for patients to come in person, we continued to have what's called a study watch, where we stayed connected with individuals, understand what was happening with them, and had a portal. If it was only an on-site experience, we would have lost contact with a lot of individuals. So I think many trials are now really thinking about this much more connected experience through trials, and even going beyond one trial at a time. The traditional model is you have an individual with a condition, they go into a clinical trial. People are very diverse, right? They're not thinking about themselves as a condition. They're on this long journey. So just this weaving of participants in a much more integrated way into the system. The second is data monitoring. So anomaly detection, there's huge strides in terms of how we handle information. I remember doing source data verification. It took a long time to clean the data. We didn't know whether maybe a site took a long time before we even got accurate data. Maybe there was fraudulent data. That is really booming. And then finally, in terms of using generative AI to have more seamless regulatory submissions, there are a number of really interesting groups and companies working on that. So there's a lot of rethinking of clinical trials, still with the core belief that randomized clinical trials and clinical research and evidence generation is the backbone of getting new therapies out into the world. But we can continue to modernize them so they're faster, more accurate, and more actionable.
Those are such concrete shifts. And I think for clinicians, it raises an exciting possibility. If evidence is being generated in real time and with higher fidelity, practice should be able to evolve even more quickly. From your perspective, how might these trial innovations actually shorten the time from discovery to standard practice?
One big advantage of being able to still hold the core of randomized clinical trials, but then get to implementation quicker, is really this understanding of how to conduct phase 4 or post-marketing studies embedded in the EHR. And so let me break that down a little bit more. So we know that traditionally, let's say a medicine will go through maybe a phase study, phase 2, we're looking at some of the understanding of the medicine, and then a phase 3 to more broadly understand the efficacy and safety. But that's still in a small subset of patients. The medicines then go out into the world, into patients way beyond what the patients were like in that trial. We have pretty strict and exclusion criteria. And so this idea that you can study patients post-marketing in phase 4 trials is very powerful. It was hard before because it was hard to harness that information. But now that the predominant number of health systems are using electronic health records, it's something that is doable. And in fact, other countries have been very proactive in thinking about these kinds of studies. I think about the work that was done in Sweden around indications with particular transcatheter aortic valve replacements. So they looked at the device in the real world, not only in the clinical trials, and it helped with approval. We need to think about the implementation, how to get patients engaged into those trials. How do we get clinicians the time to participate in those studies? That's where I see some urgency.
It does seem that with the kind of evidence we can now generate in phase 4 and the technology that supports that part of the trial, innovation feels much closer to the bedside. But with that pace also comes a lot of hype. Every new tool or therapy is marketed as transformative. From your vantage point, how do you separate what's truly practice changing from what just sounds promising?
If we take a problem-based approach, we'll be in good shape. One problem we're having is that we want to make sure that when a particular device gets out into the real world, we understand how it performs in different age groups. And we know that we have access to health records that can help. That's a problem-based approach. We know the problem and we're looking for the solution. If we keep that mindset, does this new tool help us? Does it get the job done? I'll throw out an analogy. If you're making a cake, you want the right tools, a mixer, a bowl. But if someone brings a turkey baster, like that doesn't help us. So we got to think about, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to make a cake? What is it that we're trying to do? And then let's use these amazing tools that are out there. There's a moment for people who love clinical medicine but want to engage with technology. I think there's going to be a really nice intersection there over the next years to come.
I think this goes back to what you said earlier in our conversation: feet on the ground, head in the sky. That problem-based approach, staying grounded in the real issue first and letting the tools follow, is such a clear principle for cutting through both the hype and the complexity. Looking back on your own journey, is there a lesson or guiding principle that you wish more clinicians understood about driving innovation?
The thing that's most important is to remember how much experience that you have. Really seeing and being on the ground is valuable. So we talk a lot about the user experience, the user journey. One thing I learned a tremendous deal about and really valued working with people who are thinking about new product development and technologies, they always talk about putting the user in the center. So what does that journey look like? If I use my cell phone to try to understand how to get from point A to point B, how do maps make that accessible? Healthcare is obviously more complicated, but it's still a journey. And so the piece that I really learned to respect deeply when it comes to innovation is understanding who we're really serving. What people are we creating solutions for? We talked a minute ago about having this problem and solution mindset, but who really are we serving? And so for me, I know it's funny, I walk around and I feel like I'm looking at the way certain things are designed when I'm walking through the hospital. Does it make sense the way we have patient rooms laid out? When we need to take someone down to radiology, is that really the most streamlined journey? It's interesting, this design thinking has found its way into my everyday thinking. I think it leads to a great deal of innovation because you're looking for places where you can add benefit.
That's wonderful. As we start to wrap up our conversation, I'd love to look ahead with you. What excites you most about this next era of precision medicine? And how can today's clinicians prepare to benefit from or contribute to what's coming?
What's most exciting to me is that we now have a number of really impressive technological innovations, whether it's high volume computing, whether it's new sensors, whether it's algorithms that are looking for anomaly detection, but we're actually seeing them in use. And we're able to understand and start working with individuals, people with diabetes, heart disease. Where are we making the biggest difference? And so there's this moment to start to think about the clinical rigor. I think that it was almost too early. If you were to ask me 10 years ago, 15 years ago, people talked about these ideas, but the practical realities are here. Why don't we take all the lessons we learned about new medicines, devices, genomics, and apply them in the same way to things like AI-guided clinical decision support? To summarize, the thing that excites me is that precision health is starting to become a reality. And if you can refine it, there's a lot of good work to be done. And I think we're going to start to see real outcomes change in patients who are improving.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mega. This has been such an illuminating conversation. We started today by talking about the shift from episodic care to continuous precision health. And you brought that to life with some real examples from diabetes management to modernized trials and AI-supported screening. And what I appreciate most is how grounded your perspective is, staying focused on the real problems that people face, making sure that the tools are truly valuable, and reminding us that clinicians and not algorithms remain essential to judgment and care. I've learned so much, and I know our listeners will as well. Thank you again for taking the time to join us. Thanks for tuning in. This episode was brought to you by Stanford CME. To claim CME credit for listening to this episode, click the Claim CME link below or visit medcast.stanford.edu. Check back for new episodes by subscribing to Stanford Medcast wherever you listen to podcasts.